Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about that mysterious word debugging and what extra capabilities we have when we run our program in debug mode. We're going to talk about placing breakpoints, which allow us to pause the execution of our code at a particular line. We're going to use the step into feature, which lets us inch forward in our code in order to see the variables updating. And finally, we're going to see how we can observe the values of our variables at the different stages of our program. This means we'll get to see the variables when they're uninitialized, and we may be shocked to find that they have strange values before we initialize them. We call that garbage data. And finally, we're going to look at a couple different ways to initialize our variables. So let's jump in. So what does debugging mean anyway? Debugging is the process of finding and removing errors from our code. We typically call these errors bugs. Whenever we start debugging in Visual Studio Code, we're running our program in a mode that allows us to use debugging tools. So let's run our program in debug mode and take a look at the tools we have at our disposal. So here we are in Visual Studio Code, and we have our three variables that we've created. We've got a float called root beer, a double called cheeseburger, and a bool called should have lunch. Now for each of these, we declare them on one line and then initialize them with values on the next line. We're going to place a breakpoint so we can pause execution in our code. So I'm going to hover the mouse cursor over to the left side of the text editor, and you'll see that I get this red dot following my cursor. Now if I come to the line where root beer has been declared, I can click on that red dot and it gets a little bit brighter. This is a breakpoint. Now we can run our code in debug mode as we have been doing by going up to Run and clicking on Start Debugging. Now, as soon as I do so, the program starts running in debug mode and it pauses execution. Now notice something. I placed my breakpoint here where we declare our root beer float. But simply declaring a variable is not considered worthy enough by VS Code to have a breakpoint there. We have to actually perform an action, and declaring a variable isn't considered important enough. Now, assigning a value to a variable, on the other hand, is considered important enough for Visual Studio Code to place a breakpoint. So what it does is it skips the line where we simply declare root beer, and it goes to the next line where it sees something actually happening, which is the assignment here. Now, the breakpoint causes execution to pause just before the line in question. So the assignment of 1.99 into the root beer variable has not yet happened. We have paused just before this line has executed. So this variable, as of yet, is uninitialized. Now we can hover over root beer to see its value. This works in debug mode. And take a look. It's 1.09 plus some change, e negative 38. The e negative 38 part means times 10 raised to the negative 38th power. In other words, this is a very small number. This is not the value we would expect root beer to have, and that's because root beer has not yet been initialized. We can hover over cheeseburger and we'll see that it too has a strange value. The reason these variables contain these strange values is because these are the values stored in the memory locations occupied by these variables, and as of yet we have not assigned meaningful data to them. Now we can inch forth in our program just a little bit by continuing execution by a single line, and we can do this by going up to Run and clicking on Step Into. Click on Step Into, and you'll see that execution has advanced from the line where we initialize root beer to 1.99 down to the line where we are initializing cheeseburger with 5.99. Now, of course, it skips the line where we declare the variable cheeseburger because Visual Studio Code doesn't consider simple variable declaration worthy enough to stop on. It has to stop on a line where we're actually assigning a value to a variable. So we skip the declaration line and go straight to the line where we are assigning it a value. Now remember, we're stopping at this line, but the line itself has not yet been executed. If you hover over cheeseburger, it still contains garbage data. But if we hover over root beer, we'll see that it has the value of 1.99. Now, it's 1.9900001 because floating point values always have some small degree of inaccuracy. Let's go ahead and advance our program a little bit more by going to Run and Step Into. Now hover over cheeseburger and see that it has the value of 5.99. Now it does also have some inaccuracy like root beer did, but it's a lot more accurate because cheeseburger is a double. It's capable of storing more digits. Now hover over should have lunch and you'll see that it has a value of false. This is because Booleans can only have one of two values, true or false. And because it's uninitialized, it has not yet received the value of true. Let's use step into one more time. So go up to Run and click Step Into, and you'll see that we're skipping the next variable declaration where we declare width and pausing just before our initialization of width. Now we can hover over should have lunch and it has the value of true. So now we know how to observe the values of our variables when we've paused execution by placing breakpoints. We can end our program by going to Run and selecting Stop Debugging. So we've used some debugging tools and we've found that our uninitialized variables contain garbage data. This can be disturbing because if you forget to initialize a variable and you try to use it and it contains garbage data, well, you might get some unexpected results. So let's talk a little bit about initialization of our variables. There's a couple ways to do so. One is initialization by assignment. Thus far, we've declared our variables on a single line. This line declares a float variable called root beer. The variable has been declared but not initialized. It contains garbage data. Now, we can use the assignment operator to give root beer a value, and at this point, now root beer has meaningful data. But until this happened, root beer had that garbage data, and in general, it's really not a good idea to have uninitialized variables. We can avoid this situation altogether by declaring and initializing a variable all at the same time on the same line like this. So root beer starts off initialized from the get-go. It's typically a good idea to give variables default values like this so they never start off with garbage data. Now there's another way to initialize variables, and it's called braced initialization. It looks like this. Here we're declaring a double called cheeseburger, and we're using braced initialization to initialize it. Braced initialization uses curly braces, and the value that we're assigning to cheeseburger goes inside those curly braces. We can also use braced initialization with empty curly braces. This still initializes cheeseburger. It gets a default value of 0. The integer and floating point types will be initialized to default values of 0 whenever we declare them using braced initialization like this. So this brings us to our challenge. Let's make sure our variables are initialized as soon as we declare them. Go ahead and make sure root beer is initialized on the same line that we declare it, using the assignment operator. Assign it a value of 1.99. I also want you to initialize cheeseburger, but this time use braced initialization and give it the value of 5.99. Finally, make sure should have lunch is initialized using braced initialization, but leave the braces empty and see what default value it gets automatically. Go ahead and pause the video and do this now. Okay, here we are in Visual Studio Code, and since we're going to initialize these variables on the same line that we declare them, we can go ahead and delete the lines where we're assigning values to them. So I'm going to highlight and delete those lines and leave only the declaration of these variables. Now, the float root beer, we'd like to have a value of 1.99. So I'm going to use the assignment operator and give it a value of 1.99. Now for the double called cheeseburger, I'm going to use braced initialization, and inside the braces, I'll put a value of 5.99. And finally, for the bool should have lunch, I'm going to use braced initialization and leave the braces empty. Let's go ahead and place a breakpoint down here where we assign width a value of 350, so we can pause execution down there. Let's start our program by going to Run and Start Debugging. Now we've paused execution just before the root beer variable gets initialized. Now we've paused execution just before the line where we declare and initialize root beer. So it has not yet been initialized. So we expect to see garbage data. Hover over it and we do see garbage data. We'll see garbage data for all variables because none of them have been initialized yet. Now I'd like to jump forward to our next breakpoint. And we can do that by going to Run and selecting Continue. Go ahead and select Continue. And now execution has continued all the way up to our next breakpoint. So we can hover over root beer and see that it has the value of 1.99. We can hover over cheeseburger and see that it has 5.99. And if we hover over should have lunch, we'll see that it's initialized to a value of false. That's because Boolean values get a default value of false when we initialize them with braced initialization with empty braces. So now we know a couple different ways to initialize our variables on the same line that we declare them. Let's end our program by going to Run and selecting Stop Debugging. Okay, in summary, we've learned what debugging is and how it's the process of finding errors or bugs in our code. We've learned that we have tools at our disposal, such as being able to place breakpoints in our code so we can pause execution at the points we specify. We learned that we could use step into, which allows us to advance to the next line in our code. We learned that we can hover our mouse cursor over our variables to observe their values at that point of execution. We saw that our variables contain garbage data before they were initialized, and we also learned a couple new ways to initialize our variables at the moment they get declared. So now we know how to create variables that will not hold garbage data once they've been created and initialized. We'll keep using our debug capabilities as we continue to develop our game project. See you in the next video.